When a man's young adult daughter went missing, said to have joined a cult, people simply stopped looking for her after a while. They were surprised when, seemingly, she came home to leave her baby behind to be raised by her parents she had hated enough to run away from. Little did anyone know, she was right there the entire time, held in an underground dungeon by her own father. There have been a number of cases over the years in which it has been found that parents have been holding their own children captive inside their home, many for years at a time, but none of them have been requested quite as much as this case. Given how horrific of a case it is, there's really no way to sugarcoat any of it, so let's get right into it in full detail. Josef Fritzl is an Austrian man, born in April of 1935 in Amstetten, Lower Austria. His relationship with both of his parents was complicated to say the least. His father was a man named Josef Fritzl Sr., and his relationship with him wasn't really so deep. That's because Josef Sr. was a pretty severe alcoholic who left the family one morning when Josef was 4 and never came back, never contacting him again even once. Josef himself has said, "I grew up in a poor family. My father was a no-good scoundrel who always cheated on my mother, and my mother threw him out of the house when I was 4, and she was quite right to do so. After that, it was only the two of us." Afterwards, Josef Sr. ended up fighting in World War II, being killed in action in 1944. While Josef didn't think highly of his father, he was, by his own admission, pretty influenced by the Nazi regime, and it came to stick with him for the rest of his life. Of that, he said, "I admit I have always valued decency and good behavior. I grew up in the Nazi era, and strictness and discipline were very important then. I have probably subconsciously picked up some of that, which is only normal." Throughout much of the beginning of his life, Josef spoke very highly of his mother. He gave the impression that he really admired how she raised him alone in a rigid environment. He said, "My mama was a strong woman. She taught me discipline, order, and diligence. She enabled me good education and job training, and she constantly worked hard and would take difficult jobs only to support the both of us. She was as strict as it was necessary. She was the best woman in the world, and I was her husband in some way. She was the boss at home, but I was the only man in the house. My mother was decent, most decent. I loved her over everything. I have admired her. I admired her very much, but I have naturally not done anything. There was nothing there." His reminiscing would take a creepy turn when he elaborated on that thought a little bit, saying, "Yes, probably I had fantasies about her, but I was strong, almost as strong as my mother, and I have therefore managed to suppress my urges." It wasn't until much later that Josef would change his tone about how he viewed his mother. Instead, he began to say that, in reality, she was actually very abusive, cold, and distant, saying, "She used to beat me, hit me until I was lying in a pool of blood on the floor. It left me feeling totally humiliated and weak. My mother was a servant, and she used to work hard all her life. I never had a kiss from her. I was never cuddled, although I wanted it. I wanted her to be good to me." In addition, he added that she often called him no good, a criminal, and even Satan. He said that, at the end of the day, he was pretty afraid of her. Eventually, Josef came to graduate from school. When he was 21 years old, he met and married a 17-year-old girl named Rosemary. The two eventually bought a house together, and after that, it was decided that Josef's mother would come to live with them. It wasn't long before, now in a position of power, Josef turned the tables on his mother. Now he was the domineering one in the relationship, and she was the one living in fear. Eventually, it got to the point where Josef was done with her entirely. He wasn't going to kick her out or even kill her. He was simply going to act as if she didn't exist. He put a lock on her bedroom door, locking it from the outside, and bricked up her windows. He told the neighbors that his mother had died, and from then on out, he kept her locked away until her eventual death. To this day, it isn't even known for sure how long she was even locked in the room. It's speculated to have been roughly 20 years. It's very likely that the ease of locking her away and the fact that he was never called out on it emboldened Josef to see this as being an option if he ever wanted to make anyone disappear ever again. Despite having his mother locked up in the house, Josef's marriage to Rosemary basically continued as normal. In fact, they had 3 sons and 4 daughters together. One of his daughters, Elizabeth, was born on April 6th of 1966. She, out of all of the kids, would be treated differently from the very beginning. In 1967, Joseph's ugly urges would really come to surface for the first time. That was when he broke into the home of a 24-year-old nurse and forced himself upon her at knife point while her husband was away. He told her that if she screamed, he would cut her throat straight away. At around the same time, Josef had come to be known to the police for engaging in quite a bit of indecent exposure. All of this led to him getting hit with an 18-month prison sentence, of which he served about 1 year. In addition to that, Josef was looked into as a person of interest when it came to a local murder. A 17-year-old girl, Anna Newmayer, was killed with a pistol in the middle of a field only about 35 kilometers from where Josef was working at the time. Due to a lack of evidence either way, he was never charged for anything in this case. It wasn't too long before Josef's urges began to surface at home as well. While it seems that Josef was basically normal with the other kids, he chose to start sexually abusing Elizabeth when she was only 11 years old. While Josef bragged about being able to control his urges with his mother, it seems that he wasn't so able and willing to do so when it came to his own daughter. The secret remained between the two, as to everyone outside, they seemed to be a very normal family. If anything, they seemed to be doing well. Once Josef finished attending a technical college, he got certified in electrical engineering and took a nice new job at Voestalpine in Linz. Later on, he worked at a construction material firm, and then after that, he worked as a technical equipment salesman and traveled all over the country. In around 1980, Josef's mother died alone in his attic. Around this time, he felt it would be a good idea to expand upon his house. This time, though, he wanted to focus more on building an extension with a pretty elaborate basement. So he got a permit to do so, and in about 3 years he was able to finish, or at least mostly finish, this new basement. Some building inspectors were called over to make sure that everything was up to code, and it seems that they were satisfied with the result. What they didn't know was that Josef had been concealing a much larger excavation site behind the walls of the basement. Within the next year or so, he began turning the basement into his own personal prison. He installed a toilet, beds, a hot plate, and a refrigerator. He even kept expanding upon the basement illegally, something only he seemed to know about. Rather than use his attic again, he was planning on building an entire subterranean complex to hold his next victim. After finishing high school at age 17, Elizabeth started working towards becoming a waitress. After some success, she began to work at a restaurant and confide in her co-workers about her home life. Eventually, it was decided that she would run away from home and go into hiding in Vienna with one of those co-workers. However, her parents reported her missing to the police. After 3 weeks, she was found and forced to live with her parents once again. So she simply focused on her work as much as she could until she was finally offered a job in Linz. By now, it was 1984 and Elizabeth had turned 18. It seems that Josef wasn't willing to let her go, not by any means. One day, he lured her towards the entrance of his basement complex, saying that he needed her help with installing a door. Elizabeth helped him hold this massive, heavy door into place while Josef fitted it into the frame. However, shortly after, he ambushed Elizabeth, throwing an ether-soaked rag over her face until she passed out. Then he threw her down into the basement, unwillingly making her install the very door that would keep her caged from here on out. Josef continued to make excuses as to why he did it. Normally, he would say that Elizabeth was engaging in some sort of bad behavior and that he needed to lock her away for her own good. Later on, he said, "Ever since she entered puberty, she did not adhere to any rules anymore. She would spend whole nights in dingy bars, drinking alcohol and smoking. I only tried to pull her out of that misery. I got her a job as a waitress, but she would not go to work for days. She even escaped twice and hung out with bad people during this time, and they were not good company for her. I would bring her back home each time, but she would try to escape again. That is why I had to do something. I had to create a place where I could keep Elizabeth, by force if necessary, away from the outside world. It would not have been necessary to keep her handcuffed or on a dog leash. My daughter had no chance of escape. It was a vicious circle, a circle from which there was no exit, not only for Elizabeth, but also for myself." Josef's wife, Rosemarie, had no idea any of this was happening. After she noticed Elizabeth had gone missing, she went ahead and filed a missing persons report with the police again. Nothing would come to surface after about a month of searching. That is, until Josef himself came to the police with a letter that Elizabeth had supposedly sent to him. In reality, he had forced her to write it while he held her captive. In the fake letter, Elizabeth said that she was tired of her family and was staying with a friend in a different city. She warned her parents not to search for her, saying that she would leave the country if they did. Josef, for whatever reason, chose to tell the police that she had most likely joined a cult. Little did any of them know Elizabeth was still in her home, or at least underneath it. The layout of the basement contained several extremely narrow hallways along with a very basic kitchen area as well as a small bathroom. There were 2 bedroom areas as well, each with 2 beds inside. All in all, the place was about 55 square meters of space, about the size of a small studio apartment split into a few small rooms. There were only 2 ways into the basement. One of these ways was a large door that weighed well over 1,100 pounds. Over the years, though, this door became unusable due to its sheer weight. There was one other way in, which was a reinforced metal door on steel rails. Although it was about half the weight of the other door, it was much smaller, being only about 1 meter high, leading to Josef having to crawl through it. This door was hidden in a wall behind a large shelf in Josef's workshop area. It was even protected by a keypad that required an electronic code placed into a remote control to open it. In order to even get that far, one would have to get through a series of about 5 different locked doors throughout the basement. 2 of those other doors also required electronic codes. Josef, proud of what he had created, later said, "The cellar of my house belonged to me and me alone. It was my kingdom to which only I had access to. Everyone who lived there knew that. My wife, my children, my lodgers. And no one would have dared to enter my realm or even ask me what I was doing there. I told everyone that my office was there, full of private files that were my business alone, and that was enough. Everyone adhered to my rules." Once she was in the basement, Josef kept Elizabeth handcuffed to a support column for quite some time. Initially, he forced himself upon her and then left her there for about 2 days straight. After that, he started to come in more and more often to force himself on her even more. According to Elizabeth herself, he would often keep her on a dog's leash whenever she wanted to use the bathroom, even with the basement sealed shut. From then on out, Josef seemed to show enjoyment in having 100% complete control over his daughter's every move. As far as the outside world was concerned, she was alive and well elsewhere. Given her age, nobody was really even looking for her at this point. Josef later stated, "The urge to have sex with Elizabeth was growing stronger and stronger. I knew that Elizabeth did not want the things I did to her. I knew that I was hurting her. But the urge to finally be able to taste the forbidden fruit was too strong. It was like an addiction." All while Elizabeth was confined underground as a slave, the rest of the family lived normal, even happy, somewhat extravagant lives. There are many pictures circulating of the family on exotic vacations all over the world. In some pictures, Josef is seen riding an elephant in Thailand. In others, Elizabeth's 2 older sisters are seen happily sunbathing on vacation with their parents in Italy. While some of these pictures may have been taken before Elizabeth's captivity, her absence in all of them is well noted. Eventually, Josef wasn't content with only sexually assaulting Elizabeth. In some twisted way, he wanted to make her somewhat of a second wife. He wanted to have children with her and have an entire separate life down in the basement with them. He said, "In reality, I wanted to have children with her. Elizabeth naturally had fear of giving birth, but I brought her medical books to the cellar so she could prepare for day X. I brought her towels, disinfectants, and nappies." Josef had no intention of taking Elizabeth to the hospital if things went south, but he still wanted to have the children with his own daughter regardless. He decided to himself that it was worth it to try. When it came to the first child, things indeed did go south, with Elizabeth suffering a miscarriage during the 10th week of her pregnancy. Josef wouldn't take that as a sign to end things here, though. He kept trying. On August 30th of 1988, Elizabeth's first child, Kirsten, was born. Kirsten would be doomed to live out the rest of her life in that basement alongside her mother, never seeing the outside world throughout her entire childhood. A few years later, in 1990, Elizabeth gave birth to her second child, Stefan, who would be doomed to the same fate. Having these kids around did nothing to hold Josef back or force him to reconsider his methods. In fact, he continued to force himself upon Elizabeth in the children's presence as well. On the 29th of August in 1992, the third child, Lisa, was born. For a while, Josef felt like he would simply leave her in the basement as well. However, things were getting a bit crowded. So, for the sake of opening up some space, he decided that he would raise Lisa outside of the basement. When she was 9 months old, he put her into a cardboard box and left her outside of the family home with a note. This note said that Lisa was Elizabeth's child and that she needed looking after. Rosemarie, none the wiser, accepted her into the family immediately and began raising her. Josef, on the other hand, decided that he couldn't do this again. He needed to add another room to the basement. The police weren't at all concerned with how Lisa ended up on the family doorstep. They didn't even ask why Elizabeth would be fine leaving her own child with the family she hated so much. When Josef and Rosemarie decided to adopt the baby about a year later, things went smoothly. The Youth Welfare Office wrote, "Mr. and Mrs. Fritzl have recovered from the initial shock. The Fritzl family is taking loving care of Lisa and wishes to continue caring for her." Had Josef's previous rape charge been in consideration, he wouldn't have been able to adopt the girl. However, at the time, it was normal for criminal charges to be expunged after 15 years, meaning it didn't show up on his background check at all. However, this didn't mean that Josef had changed at all in the slightest. Josef still continued to force himself on Elizabeth every few days from then on out. He even forced her to watch adult videos in front of the children, even making her act them out with him in front of them, causing her untold humiliation over the years. Josef would continue to go into the basement every morning at 9 a.m. on the dot, saying that he was starting his work for the day. He told his family that he was drawing up plans for machines that he would sell to manufacturing firms. He would often go down to the basement at night as well, sometimes telling the family that he was working overnight and ordering them not to bring him any coffee and to just leave him alone. By now, Josef was even renting out an upper room of the house to a tenant. When this tenant claimed to hear strange noises coming from the basement, they were told that the noises were a result of either the gas heating system or faulty pipes. It was around this time that another young woman went missing near the area. In November of 1986, 17-year-old Martina Claudia Posch left her home to head to a nearby bus stop. She was supposed to meet up with her boyfriend later in the afternoon. When she didn't, the boyfriend called her home. Her mother answered, saying that she had assumed Martina was with him. That meant that nobody had seen her all day, and she was never even seen on the bus. 10 days later, 2 divers on the south side of Lake Monzi found Martina's body wrapped up in a couple of large tarps in the water. The police came to find that she had been strangled 2 hours after leaving her home. At one point, Josef was investigated for his possible involvement, given that he and his wife ran a campground very near where the body was found. It was noted that the girl bared a very strong resemblance to Elizabeth. However, there was never enough evidence to link him to the crime. It's still unknown if this was pure coincidence or not. In 1994, Elizabeth's 4th child, Monica, was born. This time, Josef decided to raise her in the upper house as well. Instead of a cardboard box, he instead put Monica into a stroller and left her near the home. This time, instead of a note, Rosemarie would receive a phone call shortly after. On the other end of the phone was Elizabeth herself, asking her mom to take care of this child as well. Rosemarie was completely in shock. Given that the family had just gotten a new, unlisted phone number, she couldn't figure out how this was even possible. She reported all of this to the police, still bewildered as to how it even happened. It's believed that Josef had either brought a phone downstairs or had used a recording of Elizabeth's voice to fool her. After Monica was born, Josef decided that he really needed to enlarge the basement. He didn't do so himself, though. Instead, he put Elizabeth and the kids to work, forcing them to dig soil out of the expansion area with their bare hands for the next several continuous years. The prison was slightly enlarged and was given its own radio, TV, and VCR. Elizabeth, trying to give her kids as normal of a life as possible given the circumstances, began homeschooling them as well as teaching them about the outside world using their videos. However, Josef would tend to put the brakes on these actions, cutting power to the basement, turning off all the lights, or even refusing to bring them food for several days at a time if he ever got angry. He even told them all that he had set up traps and that Elizabeth, Kirsten, and Stefan would all be gassed if they tried to escape. He told them that the basement door would electrocute them if they ever tried to open it as well. In 1995, Josef decided to retire from employment given that he was now about 60 years old. Still, he continued working on some side hustles for cash. He worked on a variety of different jobs, such as running a campsite and renting out different rental properties to tenants. All the while, Elizabeth was pregnant again, and this time with twins. In April of 1996, she gave birth to 2 boys, Michael and Alexander. Tragedy would strike as Michael died after only 3 days. Throughout those 3 days, Josef adamantly refused to get any medical attention for him even when he struggled to breathe and his limbs were completely stiff. Rather than show care for the baby, Josef simply told Elizabeth, "What will be," and left him to suffer. After his death, Josef took his body upstairs and cremated him in the furnace. The twin who survived, Alexander, was chosen to come live upstairs with the other children who had been allowed to leave the basement. As Josef worked and maintained a seemingly normal life outside of the basement, the torture down below would continue for years. Things continued the same way for about 6 more years without much change. The monotonous torture was broken when Elizabeth became pregnant once again, this time giving birth to another son named Felix in December of 2002. This time, Josef felt that he and Rosemarie couldn't handle another baby upstairs, so he chose Felix to be one of those children to be confined to the basement for their whole life. While the kids in the basement lived in a hellish imprisonment with no escape in sight, the lives of the kids above ground were in stark contrast to that depravity. The kids upstairs didn't only live better lives than their siblings below, they were actually thriving. They had friends, went to school, and called Rosemarie their mother. They were taken to extracurriculars, gymnastics, and even to the library to rent books and videos. Lisa learned to play the flute while Monica and Alexander learned the trumpet. To all of those looking on from the outside, they seemed like a normal, happy family. And as far as the kids and Rosemarie were concerned, they were. In 2007, yet another woman would go missing. This was a 42-year-old woman named Gabriela Supekova, a sex worker who had gone missing in August. Her body was eventually found in a reservoir near the Austria-Czech border at a time when Josef had been vacationing there. Again, though, he wasn't charged in the murder due to a lack of evidence, and it is still currently unknown if he did or did not have a hand in it. After Felix's birth in 2002, things in the basement would stay the same for years and years. That is, until Kirsten fell ill in April of 2008. She was now 19 years old, having lived out every moment of her life in that tiny basement. She had always been a sickly kid, but now her health was taking a very quick downturn. She was having cramps and often biting her own lips until they bled. It later came to be known that this was due to an infection she had taken on in the basement. Elizabeth begged Josef to let her take Kirsten out of the basement into the hospital for medical attention. After debating on it for a while, Josef finally decided that he had no other choice. He allowed Elizabeth to carry Kirsten out of the basement, letting her see the outside world for the first time in over 24 years. Once Kirsten was placed down in the house, Josef called an ambulance to come and pick her up. After, he ordered Elizabeth to return to the chamber. Given that the rest of her kids were still down there, she felt that she had no choice and returned. Kirsten, meanwhile, was taken by ambulance to a local hospital. She was immediately found to be in critical condition with kidney failure, and the outcome was not looking good at all. Josef later showed up to the hospital to see her, this time carrying another note that he had forced Elizabeth to write for him. He discussed all of it with the doctor, who immediately felt that the whole situation was suspicious to say the least. That morning, the hospital placed a call to the police to report the mysterious young woman who had ended up in their care. Kirsten herself was still completely unresponsive, barely clinging on to life, and couldn't tell them anything. They could tell simply by looking at her that she had been severely neglected, though, and likely for a very long period of time. The police went on to study the letters. They noticed that the handwriting was so perfect that it appeared to be more like calligraphy, saying that the letters were oddly smooth, overly constructed, and not very natural. From the way they were worded, they seemed robotic, almost as if someone had been forced to write a very specific message dictated by another. The police began to look into the claims that Josef's daughter, Elizabeth, had joined a cult and had been dumping her kids off on her parents for years. They couldn't find any evidence that such a cult had even existed in the area at all. The police came to broadcast a message for Elizabeth, urging her to come forth and explain herself. They said that they needed information on Kirsten's medical history, saying that the whole thing was a life-or-death matter. In doing so, they also reopened the investigation into Elizabeth's initial disappearance all those years ago. Elizabeth, back home, begged Josef to take her to the hospital once he returned. On the 26th of April, a few days after Kirsten left the basement, he finally let Elizabeth, Stefan, and Felix leave as well. Afterwards, all of them went to the hospital together. In the meantime, Josef told Rosemarie that Elizabeth had come back voluntarily after all of these years, giving her quite the shock. The doctors, seeing all of their conditions, gave an anonymous tip to the police to come check them out. The same day that they all went free, the police came out to the hospital to take them in for questioning. Even after being taken in, Elizabeth still didn't feel safe. She refused to say anything at all until, bare minimum, the police could promise her that she would never have to see her father again. With that promise made, the floodgates broke and she spent the next 2 hours talking non-stop, telling the police every gruesome detail that she could think of that had taken place over the last 24 years. This was all that the police needed to hear, and then some. That day, Josef Fritzl, now 73 years old, was arrested and taken into custody on charges of the captivity and torture of his family members. The next night, Elizabeth, all of her kids, both above and below ground, and her mother Rosemarie were taken into care. During this time, Josef confessed to the existence of the basement, telling the investigators the location of the secret door and telling them how they could get inside. The police took a DNA sample from Josef and, on the 29th, announced that they were able to confirm that he was indeed the father of all of these children. If there were any doubts as to Elizabeth's story after seeing the basement, they were all gone now. Josef had gotten himself a lawyer who argued that, just because he was the father of all these children, it didn't prove that he had confined or raped anyone. However, the police soon came out to say that they believed that Josef had forced Elizabeth to write every single letter that had come from her since her initial disappearance. From one of the letters, dated about a year prior, they felt that he might have been talking to Elizabeth about her eventual release. In that letter, she stated that she wanted to come home, but it just wasn't possible quite yet. The police felt that Josef was probably going to create some elaborate story about how he had rescued her from the non-existent cult. When taken into questioning with the police, Josef said that none of what he did with his daughter was rape, that it was all consensual. However, with his own lawyer, he stated, "I always knew during the whole 24 years that what I was doing was not right, that I must have been crazy to do such a thing, yet it became a normal occurrence to lead a second life in the basement of my house." He tried to backtrack by saying that he was actually very good to Elizabeth. He talked about how he brought flowers for her, books and toys for the kids, and both watched movies and ate meals with them in the bunker, as he called it. He explained that he initially decided to lock Elizabeth up because she no longer went along with any of the rules of the household upon becoming a teenager. He said, "That is why I had to do something. I had to create a place where I could keep Elizabeth, by force if necessary, away from the outside world." In doing so, he blamed the Nazi annexation of Austria, which happened when he was 10 years old, for why he thought the way that he did. He said that it likely influenced him on how he viewed decency and good behavior. However, it was often wondered if this was merely a ploy by Josef and his lawyer to begin setting up an insanity defense. Josef was also interviewed by forensic psychologists. During these visits, he would often describe his upbringing. He described his mother, much as before, as abusive and unpredictable. He said that he was an alibi child, meaning that he felt his mother only had him to prove that she could even have kids. However, while blaming his mother half the time, Josef would also say that his troubling behavior was innate. He even said, "I was born to rape, and I held myself back for a relatively long time. I could have behaved a lot worse than locking up my daughter." The psychologist diagnosed Josef with having a severe combined personality disorder. It was noted that this included borderline, schizotypal, and schizoid types, and a sexual disorder. It was recommended that Josef spend the rest of his life in psychiatric care. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and the kids were being looked after together in an isolated area of a medical clinic under 24-hour supervision with the care of multiple medical teams. It was going to take some time for the captives to get used to good food, light, and the space to move around. During this time, a small birthday party was even held for one of the kids. In May, Elizabeth and the kids all made a poster together while in the therapy facility. For a while, it was displayed at the Amstetten Town Center for the public to see. The poster contained a message that thanked the public for all of their help and support. It read, in part, "We, the whole family, would like to take the opportunity to thank all of you for your sympathy at our fate. Your compassion is helping us greatly to overcome these difficult times, and it shows us there are also good and honest people here who really care for us. We hope that soon there will be a time when we can find our way back into a normal life." The next month in June, Kirsten was finally revived from a medically induced coma and was said to have been in good enough health to rejoin her mom and siblings in their area of the hospital. After Kirsten woke up, it was said that she was going to make a full recovery, physically at least. Her mental state was found to be a lot worse off than the doctors had originally planned for. She had a habit of tearing out her hair in clumps and cutting up her clothes. Stefan, her brother, couldn't walk properly. Given that he was about 2 inches taller than the ceiling in the basement, he had to walk around stooped over for the last several years. Seemingly normal acts, like doors being closed or lights being turned off, would send Kirsten and Stefan into panic attacks. The kids who were being raised upstairs during this time were also experiencing a lot of shock, anger, and resentment upon learning about who their father truly was. At some point afterwards, they were released from the hospital into a new location provided to them. In addition, they were also given new identities. The judge who was to preside over the case was able to state that the medical experts said that Elizabeth and her kids were all in relatively good health now, all things considered. Given that it was agreed that Elizabeth would never have to see her dad again, instead of appearing at a trial, she was all set to give a recorded testimony. She did so that July. A few months after that, Josef was finally hit with a criminal indictment. He was charged with the murder of Michael, the boy who he refused to give medical care to and later burned in the furnace. For that alone, he was looking at anywhere from 10 years to life. He was also hit with a mountain of other charges, such as incest, kidnapping, rape, slavery, and false imprisonment. Those charges also carried decades of possible prison time. For a while, Elizabeth and the kids had been living in a villa in a secret location provided to them by the psychiatric clinic. Here, Rosemarie was actually staying with all of them. However, it wasn't long before Elizabeth could no longer deny her resentment for her mother. She said that she had been unbelievably passive during all of this, simply trusting everything Josef said at face value even when she herself found it extremely suspicious. She never bothered to even try to look into the basement of her home and see what he was actually doing down there. It seems that Elizabeth also took extreme offense when the upstairs children would call Rosemarie Mom, and she wouldn't tell them not to. After a while, she kicked Rosemarie out of the villa to go live on her own. Eventually, the paparazzi came to bother Elizabeth and the kids more as well. Elizabeth made it very clear that she didn't want to come forward, saying that she simply wanted to be left alone to recover from there on out. She wanted to live as normal of a life as possible in complete anonymity. One statement she did make through her lawyers was, "I do not want any contact with the press. The aggressive attempts by individual media representatives who want to get in touch with both me and my children represent an unbearable and harmful influence." Elizabeth's lawyer said that, despite all of that, they were all actually doing pretty well in their new situation. They said that they spent a lot of time answering letters from concerned people all over the world. Felix, Kirsten, and Stefan had all been learning to swim out in the open. All of the children even came to attend a summer camp together where the paparazzi was strictly not allowed. Meanwhile, Josef was finally declared mentally fit enough to stand trial. While he was found to have a multitude of profound personality disorders, he was lucid enough to understand that what he did was wrong. He simply just wasn't bothered by it. Almost a year would pass until March of 2009. Unfortunately, after problems with what psychiatrists called uniting the upstairs and downstairs siblings, Elizabeth and the kids were taken back into a psychiatric clinic. It seems that the main catalyst for this was the fact that a British paparazzi team broke into the villa while Elizabeth was in the kitchen, taking photos of her and the entire house while she stood there in horror. While these photos were never released, seemingly due to The Sun, the publication, being afraid of being sued, one photo of Elizabeth and the kids outside of the home was published. Josef's trial was about to start. It was quickly referred to as the worst criminal case in Austria's history. It attracted attention from all over the world, with even reporters from over 20 different countries on the scene to see how things would play out. It was an international spectacle, to say the least. The trial began on March 16, 2009. On the first day, Josef was photographed from all angles trying to hide his face from the cameras with a blue binder as he made his first appearance. After all of the opening statements were made, the journalists and spectators were asked to leave so that the real trial could take place. After that point, Josef finally showed his face. It seemed that Josef was ready to admit to all of the charges against him. He did have one line, though. He said that he wasn't going to admit to the murder charge or a charge of grievous assault, one that he obtained by threatening to gas the kids if they tried to escape. The prosecutors argued that Josef did indeed kill the boy by seeing his condition and refusing to get him medical care. Josef, however, argued that the child was stillborn. Given that the body was completely burned and there was nothing to go on evidence-wise, it seemed that he might get away with that claim. In his opening statements, Josef's lawyer urged the jury to try their best to remain objective and not let their emotions dictate the verdict. He said that his client wasn't a monster, saying that he even brought a Christmas tree down for his captive victims. The prosecutor, though, wasn't so kind, instead pushing for life imprisonment in a mental institution for the criminally insane. She showed the jury the actual living conditions of the basement, demonstrating how low the height of the ceiling was along with how damp and moldy everything was. She even passed around some moldy items from the basement to the jury, the smell of which alone made them gag. The jurors ended up watching about 11 hours of video testimony from Elizabeth throughout the trial, most of which was on the first day alone. The tape was said to be so disturbing that the jury couldn't handle watching more than 2 hours at a time without taking breaks. Some of the jury was debating on leaving entirely and being replaced by others on standby. One of Elizabeth's older siblings, her brother Harold, also testified that he was abused by his father when he was young. Rosemarie and the other children refused to appear. On the second day of the trial, it has been said that Elizabeth was in attendance in the gallery wearing a disguise. She intended to write a book about the whole ordeal. After Josef saw her, his tone changed. Once he recognized Elizabeth, he turned pale and started to break down. It seems that made something finally click within him. From that point onward, he changed his plea to guilty on all charges. He confessed to everything, including negligent homicide, saying, I declare myself guilty to the charges in the indictment. After a 4-day trial and Josef's change in pleas, it was finally time for his sentencing. He was, unsurprisingly, sentenced to life in prison. He said that he would accept this sentence fully, saying that he had no intention to appeal. He was then taken straight to his facility. After the trial was all over, Elizabeth and her 6 kids were taken to a village in northern Austria, hopefully to live normal lives in a house that was described as being like a fortress. It goes without saying that most of them were going to be in therapy for quite some time. The kids who were held captive had never been able to develop into normal adults, in addition to the constant abuse that they faced. Not only were the basement captives in it for the long haul, but the upstairs children now had a lot of issues of their own, given that they had to cope with knowing what was going on under their noses the entire time. While Elizabeth didn't want anything to do with her mother anymore, she did feel bad for the kids who grew up thinking that Rosemarie was their mom. She let those kids go visit her regularly, with the knowledge that Rosemarie was their grandmother, not their actual mother. Rosemarie, from that point onward, seemed to have lived a very secluded, mostly lonely life by herself in a small apartment. By 2010, it was said that Elizabeth and the kids had been recovering very well, all things considered. Now that she was able to get her license, Elizabeth was said to enjoy spending her time shopping and driving around. She ended up becoming pretty good friends with a bodyguard that was appointed to her, who became somewhat of an older brother figure to all the kids. After a long adjustment period, all of the kids began to get along as siblings, and the upstairs kids slowly began to see Elizabeth as their actual mom. In particular, the kids liked playing video games, exploring outside, and being with their mom and grandma. After a few years, Elizabeth even slowly began to forgive Rosemarie, coming to visit her once again. The basement dungeon where Josef kept his captives, however, didn't seemingly disappear or get torn down, at least not for a good long while. It actually became a very common place for local teens to break into and party. After a few years, the basement was completely littered with broken furniture, drug paraphernalia, broken beer bottles, and soiled clothes. After putting up with this for a few years, the Austrian police decided to put a large welded steel door on the house to keep anyone from getting in. This lasted until June of 2013. This was when it was decided that the house was finally going to be sold. Given that nobody would ever buy it with the grim reminder that was that basement, they just decided to fill in that whole area with concrete once and for all and remodel the whole house. With the price set at about 100,000 euros, the construction took about a week to complete. While a lot of the neighbors really just wanted the whole house to be demolished for good, many others were fine with just a massive overhaul. In 2016, the house was finally sold for about 160,000 euros, all ready to be turned into apartments. All the while, Josef wasn't doing too well in his psychiatric prison. At one point, he got jumped by a few other inmates who, upon hearing what he had done, beat him up and knocked several of his teeth out. Some other inmates decided to take his photos and information and make a fake dating site profile under his name as well. In May of 2017, he changed his name to Josef Mayroff, likely hoping that other inmates would stop finding out who he was so easily. By 2019, after years in confinement, he was saying that he didn't want to live anymore. Even so, Josef still didn't seem to show any remorse for his crimes. When a British journalist came to interview him in 2019, he told him, "Just look into the cellars of other people. You might find other families and girls down there." In 2021, a decision was actually made to move Josef from the psychiatric facility he was staying at and into a regular prison to spend out the rest of his days. This decision was made once a report was crafted up that stated that, in his old age and current health, he no longer posed a threat to anyone. However, this decision was soon overturned. He was all set to stay in his facility until at least an appeal could be heard. If Josef was to be moved to that regular prison, that would mean that he would be eligible for parole in 2023, something that nobody wanted. Eventually, in January of 2024, Josef was moved to that regular prison. He soon appealed to the courts to be moved to a nursing home instead, saying that he was suffering from dementia, but the application was rejected. Josef is in that prison to this very day, sitting at the age of 90. His legal team believes that he stands a good chance of getting out because he is so old and in such poor health, saying that he no longer poses a threat to anybody. It is somewhat likely that Josef could pass his parole and be free once again before he dies. Josef has said that he wants to get out and live close to his old neighborhood where his house was. He has told his lawyers that he has friends on the outside who can help him, but they've told him clearly that nobody from his old life wants anything to do with him. He seems to accept that his family wants nothing to do with him, but he still thinks he has friends out there who will support him. The old Fritzl home was indeed converted into 9 apartments. It's now rented out to usually younger tenants in the area. All of them are rented out year-round, meaning that the tenants at least don't seem to be too bothered by what had happened there. In the end, Josef still doesn't seem to be remorseful but understands other people might find him despicable. He says, "Seen from the outside, I would probably think I was a beast or a monster. I only want redemption." Once again, thank you for watching my video. If you found it interesting, please give it a like, it really helps me out in the algorithm, and feel free to subscribe if you want to see more content like this. I've opened up a merch store, and people get really mad when I say it's not the Dire Trip Drip store, so let's call it that. You can get t-shirts and some other stuff. Go ahead and follow me on social media if you want as well. If anything were to ever happen to the channel, that would probably be the only way you'd ever hear about it. I also really appreciate when people subscribe to my Patreon. There you can get videos early, ad-free, and uncensored. Channel memberships are up too, and you can get the same benefits there as well. Once again, this has been your host Kyle. Thank you, and good night.